The sign was the problem. I had been to 100 markets like the one at Kethsorvath. Frontier way station goods floor, the kind that exists in the crease between compact jurisdiction and whatever comes after, where the licensing requirements are technically enforced and practically optional, where the smell of cooked grain and machine lubricant and something biological you would rather not identify all run together into a single ambient fact you learn to stop noticing. I had been buying transit components and reselling them at a 3% margin for 11 years. I was not a man who looked for trouble, and I was not a man who looked for causes. I was a freight coordinator who had turned independent trader at 43 because the company had consolidated my route, and I had not wanted to be reassigned to a desk in the administrative ring at vel'doran. I had been in the market for 40 minutes. I had bought a replacement coupling seal, 2 atmospheric regulators in serviceable condition, and a box of foil-insulated transit containers that I could move at a decent margin on the Arath corridor run. I was making my way toward the currency exchange when I saw the post. It was a standard market post, iron, sunk into the composite floor. Posts like that are used for temporary equipment display, for securing animals being sold, for demonstration racks. I had seen them in every frontier market I had ever visited. There was nothing unusual about the post. The sign was the problem. Someone had written it on a standard yellow goods tag, the kind you find in any market supply station, in plain compact standard with a blue marker. The handwriting was neat. That bothered me later, that someone had taken the time to write it neatly. There was care in the letters. Someone had thought about how the sign should look and had done it properly, had taken a moment to make the letters even. Free, no one claims her. She was chained to the post by a length of linked composite cord attached to a collar around her wrist, not a neck collar. A wrist collar, which in the exchange trade means the cargo can walk and does not need to be carried, which is a legal distinction that allows the seller to classify the transaction under goods transfer rather than labor contract, a distinction that exists entirely to make the paperwork cheaper and the transaction less visible in the administrative record. She was sitting on the market floor with her back against the post. Her knees were pulled up. Her arms rested on her knees, and the chain fell from her wrist collar across the floor in a loose loop. She was alien. I could see that immediately, and it is worth saying plainly because in a frontier market at Kethsorvath you can sometimes go a full hour without seeing someone who is clearly not compact standard human, and so the eye notices. Copper-dark skin, the deep shade that catches light differently than human brown, not the same spectrum, not the same undertone. Close-cropped white hair, the kind that reads as functional rather than stylistic, cut close against the skull without softness or decoration, the kind of cut that does not require maintenance time in a situation where maintenance time is not available. Pale eyes, silver gold, the color of old reflection in something that has been polished and left in indirect light for a long time. She was watching me. I do not know how long she had been watching me before I looked at her. I became aware of it the way you become aware of something standing very still in your peripheral vision, a gradual accumulation of a signal you had not been attending to. When I looked at her directly, she did not look away. She simply kept watching, with an expression that said nothing except that she was watching. There was no appeal in it, no performance of distress or plea. Just the steady accumulation of information about a new variable in the space around her. I looked at the sign. Free, no one claims her. I stood there for probably 20 seconds. I am aware that 20 seconds is not a long time and does not constitute a moral crisis. I am also aware that 20 seconds is long enough to read a sign twice and understand what it means and understand what you are going to do about it. Around me the market moved, other buyers passing, a vendor calling prices 3 stalls over, a supply trolley rolling past behind me, the background noise of a functioning goods floor doing its ordinary work. All of that continued. None of it seemed particularly relevant. What I understood was this. Someone had put a person on a chain, attached to a post in a public market, and written a sign in neat handwriting saying she was free because no one had wanted her. She had been there long enough that the sign was necessary. She was watching me because I was the most recent person to look at the sign, and presumably the calculation behind her watching was the same one she had been running every time someone stopped and read the sign and walked on. 43 people, as it turned out, but I did not know that yet. I went and found the exchange office. It was a standard goods floor exchange office, a counter with a clerk behind it and a document terminal and a locked cabinet of completed transfer forms. The clerk was a short man named vel'doran. I read his name tag, with the specific expression of someone who runs a business in the crease between legal categories and has learned not to be surprised by anything the market produces. He had the practiced blankness of a man who has decided that his function is paperwork, not judgment. I told him I wanted to file a transfer on the item at post 7. He looked at me without particular interest and asked my compact registration. I gave him my ship ID and my trader's license number. He ran the check, found nothing wrong, and produced a transfer form. The form was classified under goods transfer, which I had expected. The transfer cost was 0, which I had also expected from the sign, but which still landed somewhere unpleasant when I saw it printed on the official line. 0 credits. Whatever she was, however long she had been at that post, whoever had written that sign so carefully in blue marker on a yellow goods tag, the market's final assessment of her worth was 0. I signed the form. The clerk took it, stamped it, gave me the copy, and came out from behind the counter with the chain key without ceremony. We walked back to post 7. He did not make conversation. Neither did I. She was still in the same position, still watching. When we arrived, she looked at the clerk, then at me, then at the form copy in my hand, then at my face. The clerk knelt and unlocked the chain from the post ring. He did not unlock the wrist collar. That was a separate key he did not carry. He handed me the chain end, stood, and went back to his office without another word. I looked at the chain in my hand for a moment. She was still watching. I said, in plain compact standard, that I was going to remove the collar. I said it needed a key I did not have yet but would get before we left the market floor. I said my ship was at berth 14, about a 12-minute walk from the market entrance. I said she was welcome to walk there with me or wait here while I brought the ship around, whichever she preferred. She stood up. She was taller than I had expected. I am not a tall man, and she came close to my height, which meant sitting against the post she had looked smaller than she was. She stood and looked at me steadily, chin level, shoulders square. The chain fell slack between us, and she gathered the slack immediately, holding it so it did not drag on the floor. She did not speak. I waited in case she was going to. She did not. I said I would get the collar key from the equipment supply near the main entrance, and I turned and started walking. After 2 steps, I heard her footsteps behind me. I did not look back. I walked at a normal pace, not slow in a way that would feel patronizing, not fast in a way that would feel like urgency, and she walked behind me through the rest of the market, and we moved through it like 2 people with somewhere to be. The equipment supply station was near the main entrance. I bought a universal collar key set for 8 credits. In the entrance corridor, out of the main market flow, I stopped and worked through the keys. The third one opened the collar cleanly. I took it off her wrist, dropped the collar and chain both into the refuse collector near the entrance doors, and walked on. She looked at her wrist. She turned it once, slowly, examining the pale pressure mark where the collar had been, the kind of mark that takes a few hours to fade. She looked at it with the same steady, cataloging attention she brought to everything. Then she looked up at me. I said the ship was at berth 14 and started walking. She walked beside me now, not behind. Her name, I learned, was not something she could tell me in the usual way. That was the first thing I understood during the walk to the berth, not because she did not try, but because when I introduced myself and asked her name, she opened her mouth and what came out was not speech. It was a partial sound, effortful, and immediately stopped. She stopped it herself when she heard it. Her expression did not show what I expected. I expected pain or embarrassment. What I saw instead was a compression, the look of someone who has encountered this situation many times, has processed it fully, and has a method for holding it that does not require anything from the other party. She closed her mouth and looked forward and kept walking. I said it was all right. I said I had a notation pad on the ship. She did not respond, but she kept walking. The ship was a compact standard single-operator freight vessel, the kind freight companies run on secondary corridor routes and sell off cheap when those routes consolidate. I had bought it for 30,000 credits 4 years ago, and it was worth 30,000 credits, which is to say it worked correctly and had no qualities beyond working correctly, which had always seemed sufficient for a freight vessel. Berth 14 was mid-level in the way station dock. I opened the main hatch and stood aside. She looked at the hatch, she looked at me, then she walked in. I followed and sealed the hatch. The interior is not large, main cabin, 2 bunk alcoves, galley counter, navigation console, cargo section aft. She stood in the main cabin and assessed it with the systematic attention I had already come to recognize as her default mode. The way you examine a space for its resources and its exits simultaneously, efficiently, without announcing that you are doing so. I went to the galley and put water on. I found the notation pad in the console drawer and set it on the galley table. I said she could sit wherever she liked. I said I had water and pressed grain and ration packets, and if she had preferences or restrictions, I would like to know them. She sat at the galley table. She looked at the notation pad. She picked it up and looked at me, and I nodded, and she wrote one word on the first page and turned it toward me. Water. I said yes, coming up. She wrote again and turned the pad. What port? I told her we were departing for Vel'doran Secondary on the Arith corridor, 31 hours of transit with 1 refueling stop at Kethvalar Midway. I said I had supplies for both of us for the full duration. I said there was a second bunk alcove, aft of the main cabin, and she was welcome to it. She wrote WHY. I said because there were 2 alcoves, and I was only using one. She looked at me for a long time after that, long enough that I had time to take the water off the heat, pour 2 cups, carry them to the table, and sit down in the navigator's seat across from her before she responded. She wrote, "No, why did you claim me?" I thought about how to answer that honestly. I told her the sign was the problem. I said I had been in 100 markets like that one, and I had probably walked past 100 posts like that one, and I did not know what was different about this particular sign on this particular day, except that the handwriting was neat. I said I found it very difficult to walk away from a neat sign that said no one claims her, because that seemed to me like a sentence that should not exist in a functioning universe. And someone had thought about it carefully and written it in clear letters, and the content of it was still wrong in a way I could not set aside. She read this, then she wrote, "That is a strange reason." I said I was aware of that. She wrote, "You know nothing about me." I said that was correct. She wrote, "I could be dangerous." I said I had considered that. She wrote, "And." I said, and I had signed the form anyway, because the alternative was walking away, and I found I could not do it. She looked at me for a while, then she drank some of the water. We departed Kethsorvath at the 4th hour. She sat in the main cabin while I ran the departure sequence, and when we cleared the dock and settled into corridor transit, I came back to the galley and made pressed grain and set it on the table, and we ate without writing for a while, which was a reasonable start. Over the 12 days of transit that followed, I learned a great deal about her through the notation pad and through observation. None of it surprised me exactly, but it confirmed things I had understood in a general way from the moment she had stood up from the market floor. She was not mute by nature or by species. I understood this on the second day when I noticed her making small throat movements, the physical preparation for speech that then did not arrive. The equipment for speech was present and intact. Something in the connection between intent and output was failing. On the third day I asked directly and she wrote, "Injury, 6 months." Then she closed the pad. I pulled the medical reference file from the ship's library for vel'doran physiology. I am not a doctor and have no medical training beyond the standard compact operator first aid certification. What I could understand from the reference file, reading carefully and rereading the sections I did not understand the first time, was that the injury was real and serious and was not permanent given appropriate specialist care. It was the kind of injury that, left untreated for long enough, would become permanent. It had been 6 months. I wrote that on the pad and pushed it across. She read it. She wrote, "I know." I said then we would find the right specialist at vel'doran Secondary, which had a multi-species medical station with a roster I could check before arrival. She looked at me for a moment. Then she wrote a word in vel'doran script, the mid-register acknowledgement form, which the library file explained carries more weight than a simple yes. The house has received this information and made it part of its accounting. I did not comment on the register. I refilled her water and went back to the console. On the fourth day she began helping with the cargo manifest. I had not asked her to. I had left the manifest on the galley table while I ran an engine check, and when I returned she had the notation pad next to it and had been cross-referencing the contents against the market price tables in the ship's trade library. She had found 2 pricing errors in my original estimate, both small, both real, and had written the corrections with source citations. I said thank you. She wrote, "The foil container should be listed under category 14B, not 14A. 14B carries a lower tariff rate vel'doran secondary. It is a recent update. 4 months ago. Your library file may not have the revision." I checked. She was right. The update was 4 months old and my trade library was 6 months behind. I said the tariff correction would recover about 40 credits on this load. She wrote, "It is a small correction." I said all corrections start small. She looked at that for a moment, then she went back to the manifest. On the 5th day, she helped me reorganize the cargo manifest by corridor tariff category rather than acquisition order, which reduced the time required for the Keth Valor refueling stop by approximately 30 minutes because the customs declaration processed faster in the correct sequence. I had not known this was possible. She did not point this out in a way that indicated any judgment of my prior method. She simply said on the notation pad, "This sequence is more efficient for corridor customs," and then she showed me why with citations. I said I would use that sequence going forward. She wrote, "It is standard for ARETH corridor customs practice, updated 3 years ago." I said my trade library update was clearly very overdue. She looked at me. Something in her expression adjusted slightly, not a smile, but the movement of an expression in the direction of something that might become one. On the 6th day, she identified an error in my fuel efficiency calculation for the Keth Valor stop. She wrote the correction and its source. The correction saved 11 credits. She also noted that the pressure differential on the aft cargo section had been running slightly high since departure, and recommended I check the aft seal before refueling, because if the differential was caused by a microleak in the composite seal, it would worsen under the pressure of the refueling sequence. I checked the aft seal. There was a microleak in the composite gasket at the lower cargo hatch join. I replaced the gasket. She watched me do it from the cargo section entrance. When I was done, she wrote, "That seal was at 87% rated pressure. The threshold for replacement is 90%. I said I had not checked it at the last port. She wrote, I noticed on the second day. I did not know if you were aware. I said I had not been aware, and I thanked her. She wrote, you should check seals at every port of call. Composite gaskets on this model degrade faster in corridor transit than the manufacturer specification indicates. I said I would add it to the pre-departure checklist. She wrote, good. She said it the way someone says good when they mean exactly that and nothing else. At the Keth Valor refueling stop, at the midpoint of the transit, 15 hours out from departure, I went through the refueling sequence and the customs declaration. She stayed on the ship, which was her preference, and I did not question it. When I came back aboard, she had used the time to complete a full audit of the cargo manifest against the Arith Corridor tariff schedule, and had found 3 additional classification discrepancies that would have cost me credits at vel'doran secondary customs. She had corrected them all and left the corrected document on the table with the source citations organized by tariff code. I sat down and looked at the corrected manifest. I said she had just saved me approximately 90 credits on this load. She wrote, the original manifest was prepared without current corridor documentation. The ERRORS were predictable. I said that was true. She wrote, you should update your documentation at every major port. I said I would add that to the practice going forward. She wrote, good. We resumed transit. In the hours after the refueling stop, she asked me questions through the notation pad about the Arith Corridor run, about where I bought and sold, about the margins on the different categories of goods I moved. The questions were precise, and the follow-up questions were more precise. She understood trading economics with the same fluency she brought to everything else. I said at one point that she seemed very familiar with freight economics for a fleet commander. She wrote, a fleet commander must understand supply lines, supply linesr economics. What you do is a small-scale version of what I do. I said I supposed that was true. She wrote, it is smaller in scale, not in principle. I thought about that for the rest of the afternoon. On the 8th day, she asked me about the Keth Sorvath market. Not about the sign or about what had happened to her. She asked about the market itself, its structure and its location in the corridor network, and how long I had been stopping there. I said I had been stopping at Keth Sorvath for 3 years. I said it was a useful mid-corridor supply point, good for atmospheric equipment and transit containers. She wrote, it is poorly regulated. I said the compact's jurisdiction at Keth Sorvath was, as Soval Preth would later say, complicated. She wrote, I was there 46 months. I did not say anything to that. I waited. She wrote, I was moved twice, first to a holding facility, then to the market. The sign was the 3rd week. I said I was sorry. She wrote, I know. But that is not why I am telling you. I am telling you because you asked about the market, and this is the accurate answer. The market at KTHSORVATH operates on the assumption that what is assessed AT0 has no claim on anyone's attention. That assumption is incorrect. I said I agreed completely. She wrote, I know you do. You signed the form. She looked at the notation pad for a moment after that. Then she wrote more slowly, 43 people before you. I kept an exact count. Some stopped 4 longer than others. 3 spoke to each other after reading the sign. None of them came to the exchange office. I said I could not account for why they made the calculation they did. She wrote, I can't account for it. The calculation was straightforward. 0 cost, unknown risk, unknown value. Most people cannot process unknown value. They require a known return before THEYACT. I said that was probably right. She wrote, you did not require a known return. I said no. She wrote, why not? I said I supposed because the question in front of me was not about return. The question was about whether I could walk away from the sign and keep being the kind of person I thought I was. I said that probably sounded like a strange way to make a decision. She read that for a while. Then she wrote, "No, it sounds like the correct way." On the 9th day, I woke at the 3rd hour after ship midnight to run a routine pressure check and found the galley lamp on. She was at the table with her hands flat on the surface, looking at the hull opposite her. Not the pad, just the hull with the focused quality of someone thinking rather than seeing. I said I was sorry to disturb her and went to the pressure panel. She picked up the pad and wrote, "You do not disturb me." I ran the check, everything was fine, and was going back to my alcove when she pushed the pad to the edge of the table. "I have been thinking about the sign." I sat down. She wrote, "The sign said free. No one claims her. I have been thinking about what it means to write that. It means the person who wrote it believed that what is not claimed has no value, that what no one wants is without worth." I said yes. She wrote, "I understood when I saw it that I had been placed in a category of things offered without price, because they are assessed as having none. I watched 43 people read that sign before you. I counted each one." I said I was sorry. She wrote, "I do not require that. I am telling you what I observed. 43 people read the sign and walked away. You read the sign and stopped. I have been trying to understand the full shape of WHY." I said the handwriting bothered me. I said that probably sounded strange. She wrote, "No, I understand. Someone took care with the sign. That care made the content worse. The sign was not thoughtless. It was deliberate. And what it said deliberately was that I was without worth." I said yes. I said a sign written carelessly is a piece of carelessness, someone not paying attention. A sign written with care is a statement of position. And the position, in clear even letters, was that she had no worth and no one wanted her. I said I disagreed with that position, and I was in a position to say so with a form and a signature, so I did. She read this twice. Then she wrote, "I will remember this, all of it, what you did and how you said WHY." In vel'doran, the phrase carries formal weight that the compact standard translation does not fully convey. The house's memory is an instrument, not a sentiment. To say "I will remember" means the house has formally received this and placed it in its accounting. I did not say anything about that. I made water and we sat at the galley table in ship night, while the corridor ran outside the hull, and neither of us wrote anything for a long while, and that was a reasonable way to pass the 3rd hour. On the 10th day she asked if she could review the ship's navigation logs for the Arith corridor. I said yes, the logs were in the secondary console, and I unlocked the red access. She spent most of the morning on the secondary console. I ran routine maintenance checks and let her work. When she came back to the galley table at midday, she wrote, "Your fuel routing on the ARETH second leg is inefficient. There is an alternate corridor branch 7 hours into the second leg that reduces total fuel consumption by approximately 4%. Most traders do not use it because it requires precise entry timing." I said I had not known about that route. She wrote, "It is not in the standard trade navigation documentation. It is in the Fleet Corridor database. The entry window is narrow, plus or minus 11 minutes from optimal." I said that sounded difficult to hit on a one-man vessel. She wrote, "It is manageable with correct preparation. The entry point is AT mark 7.3 on the ARETH second leg. You need to reduce velocity by 1.2 standard units beginning AT mark 6.8. I can write out the full procedure." I said I would appreciate that. She spent the afternoon writing out the navigation procedure in careful detail. The velocity reduction sequence, the entry angle, the correction sequence for the alternate branch, the exit point, and the return to standard lane. When she was done, she folded the notation pad sheets together and set them on the console where I would find them. I read through the procedure after dinner. It was correct in every detail I could verify against the ship's navigation charts. The entry window was narrow, as she had said, but the fuel saving over a full Arith corridor run, compounded across a year of regular runs, was meaningful. I left the folded sheets on the console. On the 11th day, she spent the morning in the bunk alcove, which was unusual. She had been consistent in her 4 hours at a time sleep schedule, but this morning she stayed in the alcove until the 4th hour. I checked the passage outside once quietly to make sure nothing was wrong. Nothing was wrong. She was simply lying on the bunk with her eyes open, looking at the overhead panel. I went back to the console and let her be. She came out at the 4th hour and sat at the galley table and drank water and was quiet for a while. Then she picked up the notation pad and wrote, "Tomorrow we arrive at vel'doran secondary." I said yes. I said I had the multi-species medical station roster pulled up on the console, and there was a vel'doran physiology specialist on staff. I said I had already submitted a pre-arrival inquiry with the patient profile, the injury type and the duration, so they would have time to prepare. She looked at the notation pad for a moment. Then she wrote, "You did this without telling me." I said I had done it 3 days ago. She wrote, "Why did you not tell me?" I said I had not wanted to raise the expectation before I knew the specialist was available. She read that. She looked at the hull opposite for a while. Then she wrote, "The specialist is available." I said yes, as of this morning's confirmation. She wrote, "When did you prepare the patient profile?" I said on the 6th day, after I had read the full medical reference file. I said the profile was based on the reference file and on what she had told me on the 3rd day. I said I had been as accurate as I could be with the information available. She looked at the notation pad. Then she wrote, "You filed an inquiry for a patient who had not asked you to." I said that was correct. She wrote WHY. I said because the information was available, and the action was available, and the outcome, if I was right, was that she would have specialist care waiting when we arrived. I said the outcome, if I was wrong, was that I would have sent an inquiry that turned out not to be needed, which was a small waste of communication bandwidth. She looked at me for a long time. Then she wrote very carefully, "I have been on this ship for 11 days. In that time, you have replaced the aft seal, updated the trade library, corrected the cargo manifest, read the full medical reference file, and submitted a pre-arrival inquiry to a specialist on MY behalf without telling me you had done it. You did all of this without being asked." I said I did not think any of it was unusual. The seal needed replacing. The library needed updating. The manifest needed correcting. The inquiry was available to make and seemed worthwhile. She wrote, "That is what I mean." I did not know exactly what she meant, but I thought I understood the shape of it. I said I would let her know if anything came back on the specialist confirmation before we arrived. She nodded once, a small, deliberate movement, and went back to the notation pad. Vel'doran secondary came up on navigation at the end of the 11th day. I filed our arrival registration 12 hours out and got a berth in the commercial level. We came in at the 8th hour. Docking sequence ran normally until the clearance officer's terminal flagged and she called a supervisor. The supervisor was a middle-grade compact administrative officer named Soval Preth, who had the expression of someone who has been handed information that does not fit any of his standard categories. He looked at the manifest. He said he needed to verify the identity of the additional passenger on the manifest. I gave him the transfer form copy. He looked at the form and his terminal, and said the biometric on the arrival registration had triggered a fleet registry match in the Compact's interagency cross-reference system. He turned the terminal toward me. On the screen was a Vel'doran Fleet Registry record, flagged for compact intelligence cross-reference, a name in Vel'doran script, a rank designation, a status notation that read, listed, captured, 18 months, and a photograph. The photograph was of the woman sitting in the main cabin behind me. I turned around. She was watching me. Her expression had not changed. She had known the flag was coming. I could see that in the specific quality of her stillness, which was not surprise but preparation. She had been sitting in the main cabin waiting for exactly this moment. 12 days of it, I understood. She had known from the departure that this was how it would happen. I turned back to Preth. He said the fleet registry indicated she was a vessel commander in the Vel'doran 3rd Fleet Holding. Her rank was the Vel'doran equivalent of a fleet captain. She had been listed as captured 18 months ago following an engagement at the Vel'koth corridor breach. The Vel'doran diplomatic mission at Vel'herath had been attempting to locate her through official channels for 16 months. I looked at the record on the terminal for a while. I said whatever the jurisdictional questions around the transfer form, the first priority was the multi-species medical station, and after that the Vel'doran diplomatic mission. Preth looked at the form. He said the transfer was technically valid under Keth Sorvath market regulations, and the compact's jurisdiction in the area was, he paused carefully, complicated. I said I suspected it was. I said she needed medical attention regardless of the jurisdictional complications, and the medical station could run parallel to the diplomatic contact. He said he would make both calls and went back to his business. I went back to the main cabin. She was still watching. I said her identity had surfaced in the fleet registry. She wrote on the pad, "I know, I was waiting to see." I asked why she had not told me. She wrote, "I wanted to see what you would do when you knew what I was, whether the information changed your accounting of what had already been done." I looked at that for a moment. I said I had signed the transfer form before I knew anything about her. I did not see why information discovered afterward should change what was already done. What was done was done. The form was filed. She was here. The aft seal had been replaced and the cargo manifest was correctly categorized and the trade library was updated. None of that changed because her name was in a fleet registry. She wrote, "That is the answer. That is what I needed to see." I said I hoped I had given the correct answer. She looked at me. The silver gold eyes in the cabin light were very still. She wrote, "Yes." The Vel'doran diplomatic mission arrived at the dock within 3 hours, 4 officers and 2 aides, moving with the focused purpose of people who have been searching for something for a long time and have just been handed a precise coordinate. When they came through the main hatch and she stood up from the galley bench, the senior officer stopped entirely for a full moment. The involuntary stop of someone confronting the material fact of something they had been working toward without certainty of its existence. He said something in Vel'doran. She touched her throat with 2 fingers, a gesture the officers understood immediately. He said something else in a quieter register, with the specific quality of grief that is being managed professionally, held back and down, because the work is not yet finished. I went to the galley and made water and set it on the table and stayed out of the way. They were in the cabin for 40 minutes. I heard none of what was said. The cabin acoustics are sufficient to allow for private conversation when the door is at its normal setting, which it was. What I could hear occasionally was the sound of voices in tones I recognized from having listened to her. The precise, measured register of people who are conducting important business carefully, and beneath that, very occasionally, the lower register of something personal that surfaces when important business gives way, just briefly, to the simple fact of a person being found. She had been missing for 18 months. The fleet registry had been flagged for 16 of those months. People had been looking for her through official channels, which are slow, and through unofficial channels, which are slower in different ways, and the answer had turned out to be a mid-corridor freight vessel making a routine run from Keth-Sorvath to Vel'Harath Secondary. I made a second pot of water and left it on the galley counter in case anyone wanted it. No one came out for more water. That was fine. I sat on the cargo section step with the door open and looked at the dock and thought about the coupling seal I had bought at the Keth-Sorvath market, which was in the tool case in the starboard storage alcove. I still needed to install it. The existing seal on the main coupling was at rated pressure, not degraded like the aft gasket had been, but replacing it while it was still functional rather than waiting for it to fail was the correct practice. I added it to the pre-departure checklist for the morning. Soval Preth came back for the second time with a compact administrative form that needed my signature to transfer the fleet registry case to diplomatic resolution status. The form was 3 pages, and the third page had a clause about the goods transfer classification that he explained carefully in the way that administrative officers explain things when they are not certain how the explanation will be received. I read the form, the clause was standard, I signed it. He thanked me and went back to his business. Arrangements were made with the medical station. Soval Preth came back twice. At the end of it, the officers gathered around her in the specific configuration of people who intend to ensure nothing goes wrong now that something has been recovered. Very close, very deliberate. The formation of a house that has spent 16 months looking for one of its own. She stopped at the main hatch. She turned and looked at me. She had the notation pad in her hand. She wrote quickly and held the pad toward me. I took it. She had written her full name in vel'doran script, with every tonal mark placed correctly. I could read it. Sarath Vel'doran, and beneath the name, her rank designation in fleet notation, which I recognized from the registry record Preth had shown me. And beneath that, in compact standard, she had written, "You found me at post 7. You read the sign and you stopped. The vel'doran accounting holds this. Commander Scrath Vel'doran Names, you as a person to whom the fleet holds a debt of recognition. This is not formality. In the vel'doran grammar, the debt of recognition is permanent and has no ceiling." I looked at what she had written for a long time. Then I looked at her. She was standing with her chin level and her shoulders square, the posture I had not seen in her until this moment. The relaxed uprightness of someone who is finally standing in the correct context, in the conditions that fit her rather than conditions designed to reduce her. Standing the way she was built to stand, with all of it intact underneath, the way it had always been. I said I had just signed a transfer form. She wrote quickly, one final line. "I know, that is what the debt is for." Then she walked down the ramp between her officers, under her own authority, and she did not look back. Not because she was leaving something behind, because she was walking forward and the direction was clear. I stood at the hatch until the dock was empty again. The notation pad was in my hand. Her name was on the last page in her own handwriting, Sarath Vel'doran, in vel'doran script with the tonal marks correct, with the rank designation and the formal acknowledgement phrase below it in plain compact standard. Patient, precise, clear. The same care as the sign at post 7. The content entirely different. I went back inside. I had a tariff correction to file and a cargo load to move, and a trade library that was 4 months out of date. I closed the medical reference files that had been open on the console since the second day, and opened the trade library update from the Vel'Harath secondary network. The sync ran for 17 minutes, pulling in 4 months of revisions, including the Category 14B tariff change she had identified on the 4th day. I sat at the galley table with the notation pad and a cup of water going cold. I did not know what a vel'doran fleet's debt of recognition meant in practical terms, whether it would appear on any registry, whether it would matter in any future market in any corridor I was likely to run. I was a freight coordinator who had turned independent trader at 43. I bought atmospheric regulators and foil transit containers and grain supplement packets, and moved them between waystation markets at margins between 2 and 11%. The Vel'doran fleet's formal accounting was not a space I had expected to enter. What I thought about was the sign, the neat handwriting on the yellow goods tag, the specific wrongness of taking care with something that should not be written at all. 43 people who had read it and made their calculations and kept walking. The calculation was not complicated. Zero cost, unknown risk, unknown value. You keep walking. I thought about her watching from the market floor with her knees up in her chain in a loop on the composite, the silver-gold eyes running the calculation on every face that stopped and read the sign and moved on. 43 data points. 43 times the same result. I thought about her standing at the main hatch with her chin level, walking down the ramp, the direction clear. The notation pad was on the table. Her name was on the last page in her own hand, with the tonal marks correct, and the rank designation and the formal debt of recognition phrase below it. I picked up the pad and looked at her name for a while. Then I set it down and went to file the tariff correction, because she had been right that Category 14B carried the lower rate, and an uncorrected classification costs you money in margins you cannot see until you find yourself always a little short. The correction took about 10 minutes. After that, I sat at the console in the quiet dock and thought about nothing in particular. The next departure was morning. The trade library was updated. The manifest was correct. The aft seal was replaced. The cargo was accounted for. I had signed a transfer form. I had made water. I had given her the second alcove because there were 2 alcoves. I had walked at a normal pace through a frontier market with a person walking beside me who had nowhere else to go, and the chain had been in a refuse collector before we reached the entrance doors, and by the time we reached berth 14 she had been walking beside me, not behind. I had checked the aft seal because she mentioned it. I had updated the library because she was right that it was 4 months out of date. I had reorganized the manifest because her sequence was more efficient. The corridor work was considerable and continuous and required attention to be done correctly, and it would be there in the morning. Tonight there was just the quiet of the commercial dock and the notation pad on the galley table, and somewhere 2 levels above in the multi-species medical station, a fleet commander getting the care that had been owed to her for 18 months. I made 1 more cup of water. I sat with it at the galley table until it cooled, in the quiet of a ship that has carried something important and is now sitting at rest in a commercial dock at the end of a reasonable day. The notation pad was right there on the table. Her name was on it, clear and correct in her own hand. The supply calendar was correct. The pre-departure checklist had the aft seal notation. The trade library had the Arith Corridor 14B revision and the alternate fuel routing branch at Mark 7.3, and the folded navigation procedure sheets were in the secondary console drawer in case I wanted to refer to them before I tried the entry window for the first time. That was 11 days of work. The corrections were all small corrections, and they added up. I thought about what she had written on the 10th day. That is what I mean. I had not asked her to explain it further, but I thought I understood it well enough. She had been at a market post for 3 weeks, and 43 people had read a sign and kept walking. And then 1 more person had stopped and signed a transfer form and removed the collar and walked at a normal pace across the dock complex with her walking beside him, not behind, and in the days that followed had replaced the seal and updated the library and corrected the manifest and filed an inquiry on her behalf without mentioning it. She had been keeping track of what people did and did not do for a very long time. She was good at it. I thought the notation pad on the table was the right place for her name, clear and correct, with the tonal marks placed correctly. The morning would bring the cargo to move and the departure permit to file and the Arith run to begin. The corridor work was considerable and required careful attention to do correctly. The fuel routing branch at mark 7.3 on the second leg would need precise entry timing. I would try it on the next run. I left it where it was,